Newt Gingrich on the future of conservatism and Bob Long on the future of transportation, next on Behind the Headlines.
This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to a new edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenewalt, Senior Fellow for the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. And we're filming on location today at Millersville University. And we're very fortunate to have an extraordinary guest on our show. We have the former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives and presidential candidate Newt Gingrich. Mr. Speaker, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you, Charlie.
It's so nice to have you here. You've been traveling around Pennsylvania. You've just made an address to a class at Millersville University. And we wonder, as we look to get younger people involved in the political process and involved in the elections, what's the best way to do this, Mr. Speaker?
Well, I think there are two things, and I was very impressed with the number of the students and the questions they ask. One way is to convince them that this is about their life, that whether it's the price of gasoline, the likelihood of getting a job, the amount of federal debt they're going to pay taxes on to pay interest on the debt, that this isn't some abstract thing. This is literally going to affect their life in a direct way. The other thing I think that gets them involved is encouraging their own attitudes. I mean, I was very struck in the class we just did here at Millersville that there's a seriousness about this generation of students. They're looking at the job market, they're looking at their student loan debt, they're looking at what their parents are going through. They have a much deeper desire to learn about the world and what they should expect and what they should prepare for than I think people did 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. When you look into the future and we talk about the different ideologies, conservatism, moderate, and liberal, what is the future of conservatism in America? Which way should conservatism be going, in your estimation? Well,
I think we're at a crossroads where the core values of conservatism, relying on the Declaration of Independence, on the work ethic, on the idea that our rights come from our Creator, on the concept of a limited constitutional government, of returning power to the states through the 10th Amendment. I think those kind of core values are probably going to become extraordinarily popular over the next decade because they fit the emerging world we live in. And I think as people look at reality and they look at the need to be competitive in the job market, they look at the need to make sure their children get an effective education, I think you're going to see a steady drift towards more and more acceptance of that kind of conservatism by a larger and larger part of the country.
Okay. We have time constraints on this particular segment, but wanted to see if you could pull out your crystal ball. If you would look into your crystal ball, what do you think the Supreme Court's going to rule on the Obamacare case, and what will that mean for America, whichever way it goes?
I think this is a guess because nobody actually can tell what the court will do till it acts. My guess is it's going to be either 5-4 or 6-3 for throwing out the mandate. And what we don't know is whether at that moment they then say the entire bill's thrown out, because when Obama decided to ram the bill through after they lost Teddy Kennedy's seat in Massachusetts, they couldn't go back to the Senate. They were one vote short. So they didn't go to conference and they didn't put in a clause called severability, which says if any one part of this bill is unconstitutional, it is severed and the rest of the bill is still there. In the absence of that provision, if the court wants to be hard-nosed about it, they can say if any part is unconstitutional, all of it is unconstitutional. I think the odds are probably better than even money that they're going to say that the mandate is unconstitutional, and the odds are probably about 1 in 3 that they're going to throw the whole thing out.
Okay, well, Mr. Speaker, we want to thank you for being with us today on Behind the Headlines, and good luck in your continued campaign, and Godspeed.
Thank you.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania Business Council, envisioning a commonwealth in which residents enjoy a very high quality of life in sustainable communities. The Council works aggressively to define key long-term policy strategies and solutions that make the Commonwealth more competitive, creating and sustaining a better Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, helping hospitals to provide healing, health, and hope to communities across the state. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by Daily Underwriters of America, a better way for truck insurance. And by Penn Waste, your best local choice for your waste removal and recycling needs.
Hi, welcome back to the second segment of Behind the Headlines. And in this segment, my co-host, Mara Donnelly, and I will be talking about an issue that the governor had put on a temporary hold in the State of the State and the state budget address. Mara, remember during the State of the State address, the governor turned to the issue of transportation funding. He said, we'll come back to that.
Yes.
Well,
We're waiting.
Yes, and we thought we'd explore this issue a little bit with one of the best people in the Commonwealth to do that with, and that's a member of Susquehanna Valley Center's board and someone who spent their entire lifetime in the trucking industry and transportation, and that is Bob Long. Bob, welcome to the show.
Charlie, it's nice to be here, Maura.
It's nice
Good
to have you
see
here.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, you're welcome. I'd like to explore a little bit about your background so our viewers are more familiar with you. You're not only a member of the Susquehanna Valley Center board, but you've also, for example, did you grow up around trucking?
No, actually, I was a CPA and a lawyer in New York City, and my life changed when I bought a truck line in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and moved my family down here. And the subject we're talking about today is something that absolutely nobody really is crazy about. And I had to learn it because it was my business. And so I began working at the truck line, and I learned about it. I worked with PennDOT. I was on Governor Casey appointed me to the Transportation Advisory Committee that met met 3 or 4 times a year with the top people at PennDOT, Brad Mowry, Mike Ryan. And we kicked around a lot of concepts, and we understood where everybody was coming from. We didn't always agree, but there was a good consensus. We got the CDL through in those days, and a lot of other things too. Commercial driver's license
for our viewers.
Sorry. and so I have a little bit of knowledge about this stuff. I wish I was an expert on something other than this, but this is the business. So whatever I can offer in the way of insight, views, be happy to do that.
Okay, well, I'm going to turn to Mara next. Before I turn to you, Mara, just can you give our viewers sort of a quick look, a quick review of what is the status of transportation financing in Pennsylvania? Why did the governor put this off for a special session of the legislature?
Well, this is not a problem unique to Pennsylvania. The problem here is that elected officials want to get reelected, and they're not going to pass any tax increases on their voters, and at least not until government has been more streamlined and made more efficient, and obviously government has a long way to go before that happens. It's not a Pennsylvania problem. The European Economic Community has this problem with Greece and other countries. The United States national federal government has this problem with trillion-dollar deficits, refusal to raise tax rates or to cut spending, no compromises. And so in our own state, we've got deferred highway maintenance. One of the questions is who's going to lead the world out of deficit spending? This is it's almost like a drug habit. Everybody's into drugs. Everybody's into deficit spending, and we don't run our homes that way. But this is how the governments function. And so, until that person comes along, it's a gloomy picture. Nobody's going to pass a tax increase, and it's going to take a leader who has run his own division of government on a balanced budget. We have Governor Corbett, who's making a lot of tough decisions right now. He's doing that Maybe he'll be the person that steps forward, and if he doesn't solve the European Economic Community problem, maybe he'll lead the way on streamlining government, make it more efficient. And when the population sees that government is getting more efficient and less feather bedding and more productivity out of government, then I think the voters might be more inclined to say, okay, it's time to bite the bullet and spend some money on roads. I'm not too optimistic that this is going to happen tomorrow, but this is just a personal opinion. But it's going to take a strong leader who's convinced that government is now as efficient as it can be, and we still need to spend some money on roads. And then there'll be an increase in taxes to pay for these roads.
So they won't pass tax increases, but they'll increase tolls on a regular basis.
Well, you know, the legislators would love that because they don't vote those increases. Right. However, tolls, there's a lot of myths about tolls. Tolls are taxes, number one. Tolls take away from the voters the right to object to unreasonable increases. Back in 2003, the Delaware River Authority, Joint Bridge and Toll Authority, passed an increase on the bridge going over I-80 on the Delaware River, and the truck toll went from $4 to $16. Nobody really liked that, and we thought it was extremely unreasonable, so we went and got a law firm, and they brought an action against the authority. And the judge looked at us and said, there's not much you can do about this. They have the right to raise this toll, whether it's reasonable or not, and you're going to have to live with it. And that was a 300% increase from roughly $4 to $16. At the state level on funding of gas taxes, we haven't had an increase since 1990, a significant increase since 1997.
Well, so how did Pennsylvania get into this predicament where we're deficit spending and not really able to keep up with the infrastructure?
Well, there's the old cliches you hear about all the times: cold weather, bridges, and that's true. It's true enough. But you'll also hear now about the increased cost of building roads because oil was $100 a barrel instead of $3 when it was discovered a long time ago.
It's coming down a little bit, but
yeah, and
still around 100.
Yeah, and so you have the increased cost of construction. You have nighttime construction. All of these are conveniences for the motoring public. Yet there's no increase in taxes to offset those conveniences, and this is the mentality that we have today. We want the conveniences of government. We don't want to pay for that convenience, and so we're pretty much stuck in the sand on financing, and so it's a very difficult situation. Nobody wants to vote for a tax increase. It's as simple as that. Just 2 months ago at the federal level, something very unusual happened. Shippers and truckers came together to lobby their congressman on the need to increase the federal highway tax from roughly $550 a year per vehicle up to about $800, $850, something like that. And there was some productivity gains to receive from that too. But what was unusual about this, it was that the shippers who pay this tax and the truckers who have to buy this fuel and pass the cost along to the shippers came in and agreed that we're willing to pay this tax. We need these benefits of productivity, and we're willing to pay this tax. And the lobbying effort involved visiting all of their congressmen. And these are Fortune 200 companies. These aren't the mom-pops. These are really big companies that have 30 plants in 30 different parts of the United States of America. And they went to visit all of their representatives located in these 30 plants. And I didn't make this trip, but the fellow in the next office to me did make the trip. And what he told me, a very, very reliable source, is that very bluntly they were told by their elected representatives that they don't want to lose their jobs. They cannot vote. Are you crazy? If I vote for this, I'm going to be voted out, and I don't want to be voted out of office. They didn't hide it. It wasn't body language interpretation. This is what they were told. What, are you guys crazy? We can't vote for a tax increase. And this was 2 months ago. So this is the mentality that we're dealing with, and until we get leaders that can efficiently run government, streamline it down, and convince the voters that some tax increases are reasonable, it's going to be a tough sell. And it's just the way I see it.
How long can highway taxes be put off, Bob? The Casey administration the Rendell administration thought that they had solved this problem of transportation financing through something called Act 44. And essentially, Act 44 was going to, of course, toll route I-80 across the northern tier of Pennsylvania. And the United States Department of Transportation didn't approve that tolling, and then the Turnpike was going to increase its fees, and the money from the Turnpike was going to then go to maintain our roads, in addition to some being sent to Pittsburgh and Philadelphia to maintain our mass transit. But once the U.S. DOT, United States Transportation Department, didn't approve that, that all fell through. So we are left with what, and how long can we put this off?
Well, that's a shameful piece of legislation. Shameful. Number one, it was very, very unlikely that the Federal Highway Administration was going to allow 80 to be tolled. Very unlikely. If they had granted the permission in Pennsylvania, it would have been tied up in the courts for years because people were not going to stand for that. The American taxpayers built these roads, and they weren't going to stand for having now to pay a second tax on the road. The American taxpayers built I-80, and so they were not going to stand for now having to pay a toll on a road they already built. The chances of that happening, as far as I could see, were very, very low. But our legislators here in Pennsylvania decided to vote on a hypothesis that was very unlikely to pass. And why they did that to start with, I'll never know, other than they were desperate to raise money for PennDOT, and they saw this as a means of getting $1 billion a year of toll revenue off of 80 through the Turnpike, through this crazy lease, and they were going to, in exchange for tolling rights, they were going to pay PennDOT about, in round numbers, $1 billion a year, 900 million, something like that. And of course, with no toll revenue, they're left with this reduced obligation. PennDOT still receives $450 million a year from the Turnpike, even though there's no toll revenue coming in.
This is where I get really lost. Why? How could, if the legislation was, the crux of it was, you got to get the tolling, why did it continue, even though the revenue wasn't going to be coming in?
According to this report, according to the report, the expectation is possibly someday interstates will. The Federal Highway Administration may allow tolling of interstates, at which time they can resurrect this wonderful idea.
But the Turnpike Commission hasn't even reapplied. Isn't that correct?
There's no application pending that I'm aware of. No, it's again, congressmen are willing to vote on stuff like this because they don't have to face the constituents, their voters, and say I hit you with a tax increase. It's still a toll is a tax increase. Okay, it's as simple as that.
I agree with that.
And why? And I think our voters know that. And so why the congressmen can't figure this out? It's really unfortunate. I tell you, we haven't really talked about the Transportation Funding Commission.
Let's turn to the Corbett administration. When they entered office. They didn't put this issue on ice at the beginning of the administration. They formed something called the Transportation Funding Advisory Commission, which came out with a series of recommendations. What were their recommendations to close this gap, Bob, and what's happened to the commission findings?
Well, it's a long report, and it's done by people very qualified in this area, and it's a report that contains a lot of ideas and a lot of concrete suggestions, including a funding package, and it's largely a very, very solid report. It's not something that can be. I'm here to criticize. I think 95% of it is right on, and basically it talks about. Uncapping the oil franchise tax. When this tax was legislated, when I was a younger person, they put a cap on the tax at a wholesale value of $1.25 a gallon for gasoline, diesel and gasoline. And so when gasoline exceeded $1.25, there was no longer any revenue that came in from this tax. We all know gasoline and diesel wholesale maybe $3.50, whatever, but retail it's roughly $3.75 to $4 now. But there's been no tax revenue generated as that price of diesel fuel and gas has exceeded $1.25. So what this means is we're willing to pay the Arabs for their oil, whatever it is, $100 a barrel, but we're not willing to spend a couple of cents a gallon for our own roads. That's what this means. So as the barrel of oil went from $50 to $100 a barrel, the Arabs got all that money, or the Texans got all that money, whoever you want to talk about. But we were not willing, the congressmen in this state were not willing to raise 4 or 5 cents a year per gallon for our roads. But we took care of the Arabs, but we didn't take care of ourselves. That's kind of a horrible situation, but that's the reality of where we are. So the package goes into reducing that cap and phasing out the cap over a 4 or 5 year period. It would raise a lot of money. Over $1 billion a year would be raised through this technique.
And how much do we need?
Well, that's a good question. The requirements are like, in round numbers, I mean, these numbers are staggering, so I have to use round numbers, about $3 billion.
Per year.
Yeah, but the package, in addition to the oil franchise tax, talks about increase in license fees and registration fees, and there's $500 million additional there, and they have a couple of revenue shifts in there which really shouldn't be counted. But the package has come up with at least $2.3 billion of money, of new money, principally the oil franchise tax and the vehicle registrations and driver licenses. And that's $2 billion of it right there. And there's some important efficiencies. They're talking about bundling similar antiquated bridge repairs and reconstructions and smoothing out the workload of the contractors so that they've got a fair amount of work annually instead of no work this year and tons of work next year at a higher price. And they've come up with some efficiencies on extending the 2-year period on vehicle registrations from 1 year to 2 years. And they're talking about license plates good for 8 years rather than 4 years. And these all add up in small change, but it adds up to about $2.3 billion out of the $3.5 that they say they need. And then they come down and they say, well, that's roughly about $130 a year for the average motorist. $130 a year.
That's not bad.
I didn't think so.
No.
And I would think that would be an easy sell.
For repairing 5,000 structurally deficient bridges? Is that what we have?
Well, it's not all going to happen tomorrow, but it's an economic plan that sets in motion that process.
So the combination of increased revenues and better efficiencies would actually sort of close that gap and get us closer to raising what we need.
Absolutely.
Is that correct?
Absolutely. And it could be an easy sell, except taxpayers are fed up with tax increases. And regardless of the merits, if you can squeeze the bloated bureaucracy of government and get the money there, that say take the money out of there and build the roads, don't take it out of my pocket, and I'm already paying $4 a gallon right now.
There's got to be a cost savings to the individual for the wear and tear on their cars if the roads are improved and if the bridges are better. Because, if you hit some of the roads, you've got to have new shocks, you've got to, you've got to get new brakes. Has anybody ever looked at it from the cost savings from the individual?
This commission has, and it's all over the commission report. Detours are extra mileage, and that's not free
gas
anymore.
Money, absolutely.
It's time, it's gas money, and the commission's done a very good job on the inconveniences of the breaking down of the highway system, and the fact that the sell here is $130 a year. It's probably low, but even if it's $250 a year instead of $150. And that's just a number I'm pulling out of the air. No one told me about that. Maybe at some point people will say, I'll pay that $250 rather than put up with detours, traffic, And not all these road problems are going to go away as soon as this is passed, but it puts into place a process that will get us from where we are now to where we need to be over a period of 10 years.
So part of your message today is that the Corbett administration to take a look at its own Transportation Funding Advisory Commission report and perhaps try to move on many of those recommendations. Are there any shortcomings to the report or to the recommendations, Bob?
Well, I don't want to be a hatchet man, right? I mean, this is a long report, and they've done a good job, and I want to make sure that everyone understands it. I mean, if I had a vote for this, I'd vote for it, not against it. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's a couple of things in there that just jumped out at me as being off the wall, and it's too bad they're in there. But it doesn't really take away from the entirety of the report. But I have some criticisms. The recommendation that Act 44 should be continued, modified and continued in the hopes that someday the Federal Highway Administration will allow the tolling of I-80. Again, this is your congressmen who love to see tolls because they don't have to pass them. They don't have to go back to their voters and say, hey, you know what, I voted on this toll increase. Act 44 was the hypothesis for Act 44 was that you're going to have tolling of interstates, and that was going to finance the reconstruction of Pennsylvania's bridges and roads.
Yes.
And the likelihood of the Federal Highway Administration ever approving the tolling of I-80 at that time was very low in my judgment, because one, it was against the law, two, it was going to be subject to litigation over a long period of time. But anyway, the law as passed required that the toll revenue collected from I-80 would be paid over through a rental agreement with the Turnpike. It would be paid to PennDOT. About $1 million. I think we covered this already. About $1 billion a year, and the law went on to say that in the event that the tolling was not approved, then PennDOT would only receive $450 million a year, which every year they receive $450 million for mass transit and for the maintenance of the highways. But there's no toll revenue there. so there's no toll revenue coming in, and PennDOT's receiving $450 million a year from the Turnpike. Basically, what's happening here is the Turnpike is being sold. The net worth of the Turnpike, which at one time in easy money times was about 20 or 25 billion, is being reduced to the tune of $450 million a year because the money is being paid out to finance PennDOT, and there's no toll revenue coming in.
Okay, well, we want to thank you very much, Bob. We want to have you back in the not-too-distant future to follow this and see how it progresses. We certainly have to deal with our crumbling bridges and roads every day, so we need you to be the observer of that, and we'll be looking back with you in the near future. We'll be with you again next week on Behind the Headlines. We'll see you then.